The wagon wheel cracked clean through on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1873, and that was the moment Rosa Hadley's carefully planned life shattered right along with it. She had been traveling for 11 days straight from San Antonio, Texas, heading toward a man named Gerald Whitmore who had advertised in the matrimonial news for a bride with good sense and strong hands. Rosa had both, along with dark brown hair that curled at the ends when the humidity was high, a pair of steady hazel eyes that could read a room faster than most people could read a sentence, and a letter tucked inside her coat that promised her a home on the Whitmore Ranch outside of Laredo. She was 24 years old, had buried her mother the previous spring and her father 3 years before that, and had decided with the kind of quiet, unbreakable resolve that only the truly desperate or the truly brave can manage that she was not going to spend the rest of her life boarding in a widow's house in San Antonio, mending strangers' shirts for pennies. The wheel hit a rock the size of a watermelon just past a dry creek bed, and the whole left rear corner of the wagon dropped. The mule, a gray and stubborn creature she had borrowed from her landlady Mrs. Caraway, lurched sideways and let out a sound like a broken accordion. Rosa managed to keep herself from tumbling off the seat by grabbing the iron rail along the board, and she sat there for a moment with her heart hammering against her ribs, listening to the West Texas wind move through the sparse mesquite trees around her. She climbed down and looked at the damage. The wheel was not just cracked. It was destroyed, the spoke shattered so completely that the iron rim sat tilted in the dust at an angle that would have been almost comical if she had not been standing alone on a dirt track 40 miles from anywhere she recognized. She had a map. Mrs. Caraway had drawn it for her on the back of a flour sack paper, with landmarks like the double-peaked hill and the old stone crossing, and the painted boulder that someone had marked with a red cross years ago. Rosa studied the map, studied the land around her, and made what she would later describe to anyone who would listen as the most consequential wrong turn of her life. The hill to the east had 2 peaks. She was almost certain of that, though the afternoon light was playing tricks on her. She unhitched the mule, tied her one good trunk to its back with the rope she found coiled under the wagon seat, and started walking in the direction she believed, with absolute confidence, was southeast toward the Whitmore Ranch. She was walking northwest. The sun was low and red by the time the fence line appeared. 3 strands of wire stretched between cedar posts that someone had set with obvious care, straight and solid as soldiers. Beyond the fence, maybe a quarter mile across open range, was a house. A real house, with a covered porch and a stone chimney and glass in the windows that caught the dying light and threw it back warm and amber. To the left of the house stood a barn, its doors open, and she could hear the distant sound of horses moving inside. There were chickens pecking near the fence line and a kitchen garden, going brown with the season but still holding the shapes of what it had been in summer. Rosa felt something loosen in her chest. She tied the mule to the fence post and climbed through the wire with more grace than the situation deserved, given that she was dusty, tired, and carrying her good hat in one hand to keep from crushing it on the wire. She walked toward the house with purpose, because Rosa Hadley had always found that walking toward things with purpose was the only way she knew to keep her knees from going uncertain on her. She knocked on the door. There was a pause, the sound of boots on a wood floor, and then the door swung open, and she was looking at a man who was clearly not Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore, based on the description in his letter, was 41 years old, heavyset, with red hair going gray at the temples. The man standing in the doorway of this house was perhaps 30, tall in the way that West Texas seemed to produce men, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck, where it had grown past the point a barber would approve of. He had dark eyes, the color of coffee before you added anything to it, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that made up the hills behind the property. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and wore a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he was looking at her with an expression of genuine confusion that she suspected mirrored her own. "I am looking for Gerald Whitmore," Rosa said, "because starting with what you needed was always efficient." The man blinked. "Gerald Whitmore is on the Rocking W," he said. "That's about 15 miles south of here. You're on the Crawford Ranch." Rosa stared at him. He stared at her. The mule, tied to the fence post behind her, brayed once with what sounded like personal judgment. "I see," Rosa said, though she did not see anything particularly clearly at that moment. "I appear to have made a wrong turn. My wagon wheel broke and I walked with my mule, and I must have misread Mrs. Carraway's map." The man, Crawford, she now supposed, looked past her toward the fence where the mule stood, then looked back at her. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "You walked from the road?" "Yes." "In those shoes?" Rosa looked down at her shoes, which were town shoes, brown leather with small buttons, not built for cross-country travel on rocky ground. One of the buttons on the left shoe had come off sometime in the last mile. "Yes," she said again. He was quiet for a moment in the way that certain people are quiet when they are actually thinking and not just gathering breath to speak. Then he said, "It's going to be full dark in an hour. You can't make 15 miles to the Rocking W tonight, and there's nothing between here and there." "I am aware of that," Rosa said. "I've got a spare room," he said. "You're welcome to it if you want. I'll take you to Whitmore's place myself in the morning." She should have felt uncertain about this. She knew that. A single woman accepting an invitation into a strange man's house on the open range in 1873 was not something the ladies' magazines in San Antonio would have endorsed. But there was something about the plainness of his offer, the matter-of-fact way he said it, like he was proposing a completely ordinary solution to a completely ordinary problem, that made her hesitate for only a moment before she said, "That is very kind of you, Mr. Crawford." "David," he said. "Nobody out here calls me Mr. Crawford except the cattle buyer, and I generally don't trust him." Rosa almost smiled at that. "Rosa Hadley," she said, and held out her hand the way a person does when they want to be taken seriously. He shook it, which she appreciated. Some men shook a woman's hand like they were picking up something they weren't sure was sanitary. David Crawford shook her hand like she had introduced herself to a business partner. "Come on then," he said, stepping back from the door. "I'll get the mule settled and see about some supper." The inside of the Crawford ranch house was not what she had expected, though she realized standing in the front room that she had not had time to form much of an expectation. It was clean, which surprised her, because she had grown up being told that bachelor houses were uniformly terrible. The floors were swept. There was a braided rug in front of the fireplace that had seen better days, but was clearly cared for. Bookshelves, actual bookshelves, lined one wall and were full to a degree that seemed almost defiant for a cattle ranch in West Texas. There was a table with 4 chairs, though only one showed the wear of regular use, and above the fireplace, a clock was ticking with steady, cheerful persistence. She looked at the books while he went out to see to the mule. There was a Bible, inevitable, and then beside it a complete set of Sir Walter Scott that had been read enough times the spines were soft with it, and then histories, and a book on cattle husbandry that had a piece of rawhide used as a bookmark about halfway through, and several almanacs from the previous 5 years, and to her genuine delight, a copy of Jane Austen's Emma that looked like it had been read all the way through more than once. He came back in and found her with Emma in her hands. "That was my mother's," he said, and there was a careful note in his voice that she understood immediately, the note that people used when the person who owned a thing was no longer alive to reclaim it. "I'm sorry," she said, and set the book gently back exactly where she had found it. She had good taste. She had opinions about most things, he said, and that was the most she would learn about his mother that evening. He moved to the kitchen and she heard the sounds of someone who knew what they were doing with a stove, the clatter of a cast iron pan, the hiss of something hitting hot grease. She sat at the table and felt the day settle on her like a heavy blanket. Her feet ached. Her shoulders ached. The letter from Gerald Whitmore was still inside her coat, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of something you are not ready to think about yet. David brought 2 plates to the table with a competence that made her think he had been cooking for himself for a long time. Beans, salt pork, a wedge of cornbread each. Simple and hot and exactly what she needed. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke because the food was too necessary. After a while she said, "How long have you had this place?" 7 years, he said. "I came out from Missouri in '66. Was going to see the territory and go back, didn't go back." "What kept you?" He considered this. "The space," he said, "and the cattle, and then just the work, I suppose. There's something about this kind of work that gets into you." She understood that. She had grown up on the edge of ranch country herself before her family's circumstances had forced them to San Antonio. "Your family is still in Missouri." "My brother James is. He's a lawyer in St. Louis now." There was no bitterness in it, just the plain fact. "We write when the mood takes us." She told him about San Antonio and about the matrimonial news and about Gerald Whitmore's letter, because she had found that honesty about one's situation was almost always more practical than trying to manage it quietly. He listened without interrupting, which was another thing she put in his favor. "You've never met him," David said when she finished. "Only by letter. He wrote 4 times. He seems very direct." "That's one way to put Gerald Whitmore," David said, and something in his voice made her look up. "He's a fair man," he added like he was being careful. "Runs a good operation." "But," she said. He looked at her and she could see him making a decision. "He's not an easy man to know," he said finally. "But that's not my business to say." She thought about that. She thought about the 4 letters, which had been businesslike and clear about what was required of her, what the ranch needed in terms of management and domestic labor and the expectation of children. She thought about how Gerald Whitmore had not once in 4 letters asked her a single question about who she was, but she did not say any of that. She finished her supper and helped clear the table, because she was not the kind of woman who sat while someone else cleaned up after her. And David Crawford rinsed the plates in the basin without making any comment about her presence in his kitchen, which she found she liked. He showed her the spare room, which had a bed with a quilt on it that had been pieced together with the same careful attention she was starting to associate with this house. There was a pitcher and basin on the washstand, and he brought her water without being asked. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "It's nothing," he said. "It isn't nothing," she said, because she believed in being precise. "A stranger showed up at your door at sundown and you gave her supper and a room without asking anything about it. That's something." He stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who wasn't accustomed to being thanked directly. "Sleep well, Miss Hadley," he said. "I'll have breakfast ready before sunup." She lay in the narrow bed in the dark and listened to the West Texas night, which was enormous and full of crickets and the far-off cry of something wild she could not name, and she thought about Gerald Whitmore, and about wrong turns, and about bookshelves full of books on a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere, and about the way David Crawford had shaken her hand like she was a person worth taking seriously. She told herself these thoughts were merely the residue of an exhausting day. Then she closed her eyes and slept harder and more soundly than she had in weeks. She woke before the sky was properly light, pulled on her dress and pinned her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, and came out of the room to find David already at the stove. There was coffee on the table and eggs in the pan, and the fire was going, and the early morning light was coming through the east window in long pale streaks across the wooden floor. He turned when he heard her footstep. "Morning," he said. "Sit down. It's almost ready. Can I do anything?" "The bread is in the cloth there," he said, nodding toward the counter. "You could slice it." She found the knife and sliced the bread, and they had breakfast together with the same easy quiet of the night before, and she had the peculiar sensation that she had been eating breakfast in this kitchen for years, which she attributed to being not fully awake. "The wagon," she said. "I left it on the road. The wheel is destroyed, but the frame is sound." "I can go get it later today," he said. "I know a man in Carrizo Springs who can repair the wheel. It'll take a few days." A few days. She was going to the Whitmore ranch this morning, she reminded herself. Gerald Whitmore was expecting her, or at least expecting the woman who was supposed to arrive. "I have to get to Mr. Whitmore's," she said. "I'll take you," he said. "I said I would. And the wagon. I'll get it on the way back." He said this as if all of it were obvious, as if it caused him no trouble at all, and she looked at him across the table and tried to figure out if he was putting on a face about it. He didn't appear to be. They rode out an hour after sunrise, her on the mule and him on a bay horse named Franklin that was the most beautiful horse she had ever seen in her life. A fact she kept to herself for about 4 minutes before she said it out loud because she was not very good at keeping observations to herself. David looked at her sideways. "He's a good horse," he said, with the particular tone of a man who is deeply pleased but is not going to say so. The land was extraordinary in the morning. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only existed early in the day in the high desert, so clear it almost hurt to look at it, and the scrub and the rock and the dry creek beds caught the low sun in a way that made everything look briefly golden and important. Rosa had spent 3 years in San Antonio and had almost forgotten this. The sense of scale the open country gave you. How it reminded you in a not unkind way that you were small, but that being small in an enormous and beautiful place was not the worst fate. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. She asked it without planning to and then sat with it because she was aware it was a personal question for someone she'd known for less than a day. David rode for a moment without answering. Franklin's hooves on the hardpan made a steady rhythm. "Sometimes," he said. "In the winter mostly. The summers are busy enough that you don't have time for it." "I've been lonely in the middle of a city," she said. "There's something worse about that, I think." He looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his full attention, the way he had of actually looking at you when you said something he found interesting. "Yes," he said. "I think you're right about that." The Rocking W appeared after about 2 hours of riding, a larger operation than the Crawford Ranch, with more outbuildings and a bigger house, and a good many hands visible near the corrals. Rosa straightened on the mule's back and felt the letter inside her coat and reminded herself what she was here for. Gerald Whitmore came out onto the porch when he heard horses. He was exactly as his letter had described, heavyset and broad, with the red and gray hair and a face weathered to the color of old saddle leather. He was perhaps 42, and he looked at Rosa with a frank, assessing gaze that was not unkind but was also not warm. "Miss Hadley," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "You're a day late," he said. "My wagon wheel broke," she said. "Mr. Crawford was kind enough to put me up for the night and bring me here this morning." Gerald Whitmore looked at David with an expression that was unreadable. "David," he said. "Gerald," David said, equally neutral. There was something between them that Rosa could not yet name, some history or tension that sat in the air between the two men like a weather front. She spent the day at the Rocking W. Gerald Whitmore showed her the house and the yard, and talked about the operation with the businesslike precision of his letters. She listened carefully and asked sensible questions and worked hard to picture herself here, to see the shape of the life he was describing. It was not a bad life. It was in fact a good life by most material measures, a solid house, a productive ranch, food and security, and a clear role. But Gerald Whitmore talked about his ranch the way some men talked about their wives, as a possession he was proud of and intended to maintain, and he talked about what he needed in a wife the way he might talk about what he needed in a good piece of equipment. Reliable, durable, suited to the work. She was not offended. She had known this was the nature of these arrangements. She had agreed to it in essence when she had answered the advertisement. But standing in Gerald Whitmore's well-maintained kitchen, listening to him describe the schedule he expected kept, the meals to be prepared at what hours, the accounts to be managed, the hands to be dealt with, she felt something that she had not quite let herself feel before, a quiet, interior resistance, like a horse that doesn't exactly bolt but just stops moving forward and you cannot make it go. At supper that evening, Gerald Whitmore's 2 ranch hands, A young man named Pete and an older one called Sawyer ate at the table with them, and the conversation was about cattle prices and the weather and a fence that needed repair on the South Range. Rosa ate quietly and contributed when she was asked something direct, and she watched how Gerald Whitmore moved through his own house with total authority and zero particular warmth. And she thought about breakfast that morning in a different kitchen, and about a bookshelf with Jane Austen on it, and about being treated like a person worth taking seriously. She told Gerald Whitmore that evening that she needed a day to settle herself before she gave him her final answer. He looked at her with those pale, flat eyes and said that was reasonable, that he was a patient man when patience was warranted. She did not sleep well at the Rocking W in the morning. She rose before the household and sat on the porch with the dawn coming up red and gold over the hills, and she had a conversation with herself that was more honest than most of the conversations she had had in the past 3 years. She had come here for security. She had come here because she had no one and nothing in San Antonio, and because the world in 1873 was not a place that offered many single women without family or money a great range of options. She had come here to build something, even if it was built on practical terms rather than romantic ones. She had told herself that was enough, and she had believed it. She was not certain she believed it anymore. David Crawford arrived mid-morning with her wagon, its wheel repaired and the whole thing moving perfectly fine, hitched behind Franklin with a length of rope. He pulled up at the Rocking W fence, and she was already walking toward him before she quite decided to. "How'd you manage the wheel so fast?" she said. "Knew a man who had a spare rim that fit," he said, climbing down from Franklin. "Took about an hour, wagon's good to go." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "How are you getting on?" he said. "Here." She could have said fine. She almost said fine. Instead she said, "I don't think I'm going to stay." He was quiet, and she could see him thinking through the implications of this. "Where will you go?" he said. And there was nothing presumptuous in how he asked it, just a genuine concern for her practical situation. "I'm not entirely sure," she said honestly. "I have some money. Not a great deal, but enough to get to somewhere. There's a town called Uvalde about 40 miles west. I thought perhaps there might be work there, schools or a dry goods or something." "There's work in Uvalde," he said, "but it's not easy to find boarding there for a single woman." He paused. "The woman who runs the general store is decent. Her name is Helen Pryor. She might know of something." Rosa looked at him. "How do you know Uvalde so well?" "I take cattle to market there twice a year," he said. "I know most of the town at this point." She nodded. She was trying to think through logistics, which was the thing she always did when she was trying not to think through feelings. "Miss Hadley," David said. She looked up. "I have a proposition," he said, "and I want you to understand before I say it that I'm saying it practically, not improperly." "All right," she said. "My ranch needs managing," he said. "I've been running it alone for 7 years and it's doing fine, but the books are a mess and the kitchen garden died this summer for lack of proper attention, and I don't have any help besides a man named Joe who works the cattle with me. I'm not offering you work as a hand. That's not what I mean. But if you needed a place to stay while you figure out your situation, you could stay at the Crawford Ranch, and I'd pay you a fair wage for whatever help you could offer. That's all it is." She looked at him for a long time. She could feel the shape of every question she should ask lined up in her head. Was this appropriate? What would people say? Was this wise? "You're saying stay anyway," she said, "even though I showed up at the wrong place." Something shifted in his expression, something careful becoming something a little less careful. "I suppose I am," he said. She thought about Gerald Whitmore's kitchen. She thought about David Crawford's bookshelf. She thought about the way the Crawford ranch house had felt in the morning with the light coming through the east window, like a place where someone was actually living rather than just maintaining a property. "A fair wage," she said. "I'll do better than fair," he said. "And I'll need proper boarding, my own room, my own space." "You had that last night," he said. She had. "All right," she said. "I'll need to speak to Mr. Whitmore." Gerald Whitmore received the news with less distress than she had feared, and perhaps slightly less distress than the situation warranted on a human level. He said that he appreciated her directness and that he hoped she understood the inconvenience, and she said that she did and was sorry for it, and he said that he supposed he'd place another advertisement, and she said she thought that was reasonable, and they parted ways with a handshake, which in retrospect felt like exactly the right note on which to end something that had never really begun. She climbed up onto her wagon, with the repaired wheel and the mule who had forgiven her for the 2 days of inconvenience, and she followed David Crawford and his beautiful bay horse back along the road to the Crawford ranch, and she told herself with great firmness that this was a purely practical decision, and that she was going to make the most of it in a purely practical way. She told herself this for about 3 days before she stopped believing it entirely. The Crawford Ranch was, she discovered over those first days, a place of genuine and interesting character. The land itself was part of it, the way the light changed across the range at different hours, the way the hills to the west went purple at sunset, the way the mornings were so clear and cold they made your eyes water. But it was also the house and what it held, because David Crawford was, under the work-hardened exterior of a West Texas cattle rancher, a person of quiet complexity. He read at night. She found this out on the 3rd evening when she could not sleep, and came out to the main room for water, and found him at the table with a candle and a history of the Roman Republic, reading with the same focused attention he gave everything. He looked up when she appeared, and neither of them said anything awkward about it, just the fact of it, a man reading at his table at 10 at night and a woman who had gotten up for water. "You'll ruin your eyes," she said. "Probably," he said amiably. "The candle light's not ideal. What's the book?" He held up the spine. She squinted at it in the low light. "Is it good?" "It's been sitting on that shelf for 3 years," he said. "I finally got to it." She got her water and went back to bed and lay in the dark thinking that she was going to have a great deal of trouble keeping her feelings purely practical. He worked from before sunrise until the light was gone most days, she learned. He and his ranch hand Joe Medina, a quiet, capable man from a Mexican family that had been in the territory for 100 years before Texas was Texas, ran the cattle operation together with a thoroughness that impressed her. She had been around cattle ranches enough to know competent from skilled, and David Crawford was skilled. She worked too. She attacked the kitchen garden first, because it was October, and if she was fast about it, she could get winter vegetables established, turnips and cabbages and onions, and she spent the better part of a week rebuilding it with the tools she found in the barn and seeds she bought when David next went to town. She went through the books and found they were not as bad as he'd implied, just disorganized in the way that things get when a person is doing everything alone and keeping figures in their head rather than on paper. She reorganized the accounts and found that the Crawford Ranch was, in fact, doing quite well financially, better than David seemed to know, or at least better than he let on. "You're more solvent than you think," she told him one evening, showing him the ledger. He looked at the figures she'd laid out. "I don't keep close track," he admitted. "I can see that," she said, "but it's actually working. If you were to put in another 50 head next spring and sell in Uvalde in October, you'd have enough to build the new barn you mentioned." He looked at her with that expression she'd started to think of as his interested expression, the one where the stillness of his face actually meant he was paying complete attention. "You know ranching finances," he said. "I know numbers," she said, "and I grew up around it." "Where?" She told him about her family, the way they had once had a small spread in the hill country before a bad year, and then another bad year had taken it piece by piece, until her father had died owing more than they owned, and her mother had moved them to the city because it was the only option. She had not talked about this to anyone in a long time. It came out more steadily than she expected. He listened the way he listened to everything, fully and without filling the silences with noise. When she finished, he said, "Your father sounds like a man who worked hard." "He did," she said. He just had bad luck and then worse luck. That's all it was. That's enough sometimes, David said. She had to look away from him for a moment because the simple decency of that answer affected her more than she was prepared for. In the weeks that followed, a routine settled over the Crawford ranch that had an inevitability to it, as if they had been doing this for years rather than weeks. She made breakfast while he did the early morning feeding. He came in at midday and they ate together and talked about what the morning had brought, problems with the cattle, things she'd found in the accounts, the state of the garden. Joe Medina sometimes joined them and sometimes ate with his family on his own small property a mile east, and when he came, he brought news from that direction, family news, gossip from Uvalde that had filtered out occasional talk of trouble along the border. The border trouble was real. It was 1873, and West Texas was not entirely peaceful. There were raids from across the Rio Grande, disputes over land and cattle that sometimes turned violent, and the inequities built into the very structure of the region were hard to ignore. Joe Medina talked sometimes about the land that had belonged to his family for generations before the legal machinery of the American state had rearranged things, not with bitterness, but with the flat recitation of fact that was almost worse than bitterness. Rosa listened to him and thought about fairness, and about how the official story of places was almost never the whole story. David listened too, and she noticed that he spoke to Joe Medina with respect that was genuine rather than performed, that he asked Joe's opinion and took it seriously, that Joe was a partner in the operation, in fact, if not in the formal legal structure, and that David seemed aware of this gap and uncomfortable with it in a way that was doing him credit. She mentioned this to David one evening obliquely, and he was quiet for a long time before he said, "Joe's family has been here longer than mine by about a century. I know that. I don't know how to make that right. I try to be fair." "You could make him a partner on paper," she said. It was forward of her to say, and she knew it, but she said it anyway. He looked at her sharply, and then the sharpness softened. "I've thought about it," he said. They were sitting on the porch in the blue dusk, the November air gone cool enough to be pleasant, and the stars were beginning to appear over the eastern hills in that particular West Texas way they had, appearing all at once like someone had thrown salt across dark cloth. Rosa had her shawl around her and her feet up on the porch rail, a position she had adopted without particularly deciding to, because the Crawford Ranch porch was the most comfortable porch she had ever sat on. "You think about a lot of things you don't mention," she said. "I think better when I'm quiet," he said. "And then what? You just think and don't do." "Sometimes," he said. "Less now than I used to." He said this looking at the stars, but she had the clear sense that it was directed at her, and she let it sit there between them like a stone in a quiet creek, present and undeniable. She was in love with him. She had known it for about a week, had been arguing with it for that whole week with diminishing success, and sitting on the porch with the stars coming out, she looked at this fact directly and stopped arguing. She was in love with David Crawford, who had opened his door to a stranger and said stay anyway, who read Roman history by candlelight, who worked with his hands from before dawn, who treated her like someone whose opinions were worth hearing, who shook her hand like she was a person. She was in love with him in the way you love something that you recognize, the way you feel when you hear music you've never heard before but somehow already know. The question was what to do about it. She was still technically a woman without a permanent situation. She was boarding here for wages, doing work that needed doing, and she had been honest with herself about the fact that this arrangement was finite, that she would need to figure out her future more formally. She was not so lost in feelings that she had forgotten the realities of her situation. She also knew, because she was good at reading people, and she had been reading David Crawford with considerable attention for weeks, that the feeling was not one-sided. She had caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She knew the way he tilted toward her when they were talking, the way his voice changed slightly when he said her name. She knew that he had started making small adjustments, that the spare candle on her bedroom washstand had been replaced with a taller, better one, that the chair nearest the fire in the evening was always angled for her comfort, that he had ridden 14 miles to the town of Carrizo Springs last week and come back with a small tin of good tea because she had mentioned once that she missed having proper tea in the mornings. Men did not ride 14 miles for tea for women they were merely employing. But she was not going to push. She had found that pushing at things before they were ready generally ruined them, and this was too important to ruin. November moved toward December. She helped Joe Medina's wife, Elena, deliver their third child, a boy they named Tomás, and the experience of it, sitting in the small house a mile east while Elena worked through it with fierce competence and Joe paced outside, and the two older children slept in the corner, left Rosa feeling tender and large-hearted in a way that was hard to describe. She told David about it when she got back to the ranch in the small hours of the morning, and he listened and asked if Elena and the baby were well, and when she said yes, a boy and both of them strong, something moved across his face that she thought she understood. He wanted children of his own someday. She had seen it in the way he was with the Medina children, careful and easy with them, making space for them the way certain adults naturally do. It was not a desperate wanting, not a thing he wore on his face, just something that was there like bedrock. She woke one morning in December to find 3 inches of snow on the ground, which was unusual for West Texas and particularly dramatic in the way it had smoothed everything into white and silence. She stood on the porch in her coat and stared at it, and David came up beside her with 2 cups of coffee and stood there too, both of them looking at the transformed world. "I haven't seen snow in 3 years," she said. "It won't last," he said. "By noon it'll be mud." "Then we should appreciate it now," she said, and without thinking she leaned slightly into his arm, not much, just the small shift of weight that is its own kind of statement, and he did not move away, and neither did she, and they stood like that looking at the snow until the coffee got cold. That afternoon he asked her to come with him to check the south fence line, which had no particular reason to need checking in terms of ranch operations she could identify, and she put on her coat and boots and climbed up onto Franklin with him, because he had suggested they take the horse rather than the wagon on account of the snow, and she sat behind him on the saddle and held on because she had to, and she thought, "This is the warmest I have been in years." They checked the south fence, which was entirely fine, and rode back across the snow-whitening range with the sky going the color of pewter over the hills, and she thought about what she was going to do about this situation, because the situation was becoming increasingly obvious. "Rosa," he said, just her name. Not a question or a statement, just her name. "Yes," she said. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. He stopped Franklin at the top of a low rise where you could see the ranch house below them, smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air. He turned in the saddle to look at her, which required some doing given the shared saddle situation, and she looked back at him. "I'm aware," he said, with the careful precision of a man who has been rehearsing this but has not rehearsed it quite enough, "that you came here by accident, and that you've been here in a particular capacity, and that the arrangement we have is not a permanent one." "That's true," she said. "I'm also aware," he said, "that I haven't wanted to say anything about this because it seemed presumptuous given the circumstances, but I find I'm reaching a point where not saying anything is becoming its own kind of problem." She waited. The smoke went straight up from the chimney. The snow on the hills was already going patchy. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not in the arrangement we have. I'd like you to stay as if you were willing as my wife. And I want to say it plainly because I don't think you'd appreciate anything less than plain, and I think you deserve to know that it's not a practical proposition I'm making. It's not about the books or the garden or any of that. I mean that it's you I want to stay, not someone to keep house." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. The horse shifted under them and she held on to David's coat and looked at his face, which was as honest and open as she had ever seen it, the careful stillness entirely gone, and what was underneath it was everything she had been reading in him for weeks, plain and clear and undeniable. "You are the most direct man I have ever met," she said. "I learned it from you," he said, and despite everything she laughed. "Yes," she said, "that is my answer, yes." He kissed her there on the horse on the snowy hillside in December of 1873, which was not the most practical location, but was absolutely the right one. The kiss was careful at first and then was not careful at all, and Franklin stood with the patience of a very good horse and waited for them to finish. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, and everything looked exactly the same and completely different. They were married in January by the circuit preacher who came through the area on his quarterly rounds, a cheerful man named Reverend Aldous Briggs, who had performed more West Texas marriages than he could count, and who seemed genuinely delighted by this one, for reasons he did not fully articulate. The ceremony was in the Crawford Ranch house with Joe and Alina Medina as witnesses, baby Tamaz in his mother's arms. Alina cried, which made Rosa want to cry, and she held it together by looking at David, which helped and also did not help in the way that looking at the person you love when you are trying not to feel things never helps. David had procured a ring, which she had not expected, a small gold band that had belonged. He told her quietly before Reverend Briggs began, to his mother, and he asked her if she minded, and she said she did not mind in the slightest, and she has worn it every day since. After the Reverend had gone and the Medinas had gone back to their place with warm wishes, and the ranch house was quiet, Rosa stood in the kitchen and looked around at the familiar room and felt, in some wordless but absolute way, that she was home. She could not have told you what home felt like when she had been in San Antonio, or on the road to a man she had never met, or even in the first days at the Crawford Ranch. But she knew what it felt like now. David came and stood beside her, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen in the winter afternoon light, and neither of them spoke, because it was not a moment that required speaking. The winter was long and quiet and full. She had thought, in some vague and not entirely thought-out way, that being married would feel different from the weeks she had already spent at the ranch, but it did not feel different in the ways she had imagined, and it felt profoundly different in ways she had not anticipated. It was the accumulation of small things. The way he reached for her hand in the evenings without apparent thought, as if the hand were there and his reach for it were a law of nature. The way she learned his sleeping rhythms, and the particular way his breathing changed when he was worrying about something, lying in the dark, turning it over. The way they argued, twice in that first winter, fully and fairly, and the way both times it resolved into honesty and then into something better than what had existed before the argument, something clearer and stronger. She told him things she had never told anyone. The full shape of her loneliness in San Antonio, the night she had sat in Mrs. Carraway's boarding house, listening to the sounds of other lives through the wall, and feeling like a person looking at a painting of a landscape, and being unable to step into it. The fear she had carried about the future for years, the particular fear of women without resources or family in a world that requires resources or family. The thing she missed most about her mother, which was not any large thing but the specific way her mother had laughed at her own jokes, a little surprised by them, as if she had not known the joke was in her until it came out. He told her things too, about coming to Texas at 23 with almost nothing, working as a hand for 2 years before he had saved enough to stake his own claim. About a woman he had wanted to marry when he was 25, before the ranch. A woman in Missouri who had looked at the territory he was planning to go to and said she would not go anywhere there was not a proper town. About the loneliness he had mentioned that first night and what it had actually been like, the winters particularly, when the work was slower and the silence was larger. "I read everything I owned 4 times over in those winters," he said. "I wrote to my brother more than he wanted to hear from me." "What did he write back?" she said. "That I should come home," David said. "That no piece of land was worth it." Was he right? "No," David said simply, and looked around at the ranch house with its bookshelves and its braided rug and its window facing east, where the morning light came in. "But I'm glad you showed up when you did." Spring came, and with it the work expanded. Rosa took full charge of the kitchen garden and added to it, putting in tomatoes and peppers and beans, herbs along the south wall of the house where they'd get the most sun. She also began keeping a small account book separate from the ranch books, tracking household expenses and the kitchen garden produce, with the exactness that her father had once told her was her best quality, and that her mother had once told her made her difficult to live with, and she had long suspected both of them were correct. She went into Uvalde twice in the spring with David and began to know the town. She met Helen Pryor at the general store and liked her enormously, a broad-shouldered woman of 50 who had run the store alone since her husband died 7 years ago, and who had opinions about everything and shared them freely, which Rosa found deeply refreshing. Helen had a granddaughter who lived with her, a girl of 12 named Clara who had a serious face and excellent posture, and who told Rosa on their second meeting that she intended to become a school teacher, which Rosa told her was a very fine thing to intend. She also met, on that second trip to Uvalde, a man named Franklin Creed, which struck her because the horse's name was Franklin, and she mentioned this to David afterward. He did not find Franklin Creed amusing. Franklin Creed was a land speculator who had been buying up range land in the area and reselling it east at a significant profit, and his buying methods were the kind that relied on legal technicalities and the inability of ranchers to produce perfect paperwork. He had a smooth way of speaking and good clothes, and he was connected to people in the county administration in ways that were concerning if you were paying attention. "He's been approaching some of the smaller operations," David said as they drove back in the wagon, the familiar West Texas range going amber in the afternoon light around them. "Trying to buy low. He got the Hennessy brothers' place last fall." "Is he going to approach you?" she asked. "He might try," David said, "but our deed is clear. I have it all documented properly." He was quiet for a moment. "It's Joe I'm worried about. His family's claim goes back generations, but the paperwork it's complicated. The kind of complicated that a man like Creed knows how to use." Rosa looked at the road ahead. "Then we need to make sure Joe's paperwork is not complicated," she said. "Does your brother, the lawyer, know anyone in the territory?" David looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if you want to do something about the partnership you mentioned months ago, now would be a good time to do it formally and with documentation, so that it cannot be undone by someone with a briefcase and good shoes," she said. He was quiet with the considering kind of quiet. Then he said, "Write the letter to James. I'll sign it." She wrote to James Crawford that week, a careful, specific letter explaining the situation and what was needed. James Crawford, to his credit, replied within 3 weeks with references to 2 lawyers in San Antonio who handled land matters, and a note that said he was glad David had someone sensible around him, which Rosa found equal parts flattering and exasperating. It took 4 months, including 2 trips to San Antonio and more paperwork than she had handled since she'd been straightening David's accounts. But by summer of 1874, the Crawford Ranch formally recognized Joe Medina as a co-owner of the southern range that his family had worked for decades. Joe sat at the table in the ranch house kitchen and read through the documents with Alina beside him and baby Tamaz on the floor, and then he looked up at David and at Rosa and he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, that he hoped they understood what this meant to him and to his family. "We know," David said. Alina reached across the table and held Rosa's hand briefly, and Rosa held it back. Franklin Creed appeared at the Crawford Ranch in August of that year, on a hot afternoon when David was out on the range, and Rosa was alone in the house. He arrived on a good horse with a good hat and a smile that was professional and practiced, and Rosa invited him onto the porch and offered him water from the pitcher, because it was August and she was not uncivilized. He told her he was interested in discussing the acquisition of the Crawford Ranch's eastern pasture. He offered a price that she recognized was deliberately below market. He was pleasant about it and said all the right things, and had the particular kind of condescension that certain men applied to women when they believed the woman would defer eventually if approached patiently enough. "Mr. Creed," Rosa said, when he had finished laying out his offer, "I appreciate you coming out here personally. I'd suggest, as a business matter, that you not come again. My husband and I are not selling any part of this ranch, not the eastern pasture and not anything else, and our documentation is entirely in order. If you have any further interest in property in this area, I'd recommend speaking to Joe Medina, who you may not have known is a co-owner of the Southern Range, and who I expect will have similar news for you." Franklin Creed looked at her with the expression of a man who has miscalculated and knows it. He left politely because there was nothing else to do. She told David about it that evening and watched a complicated expression move across his face, which she eventually identified as pride and something adjacent to relief. "You didn't wait for me," he said. "He was here and you weren't," she said. "Was I supposed to tell him to come back?" "No," he said, and he said it with a smile she was increasingly fond of, the particular one he had that was not quite a full smile but was larger than his usual careful expression. "No, you weren't." She was 3 months along by September of 1874, which she had suspected since July and confirmed when she made a trip to Uvalde and had a conversation with the doctor there, a competent woman named Dr. Vera Sutton, who had set up practice in Uvalde 2 years earlier and who had, Rosa thought, the best handshake of anyone she had met since arriving in West Texas, which was saying something. She told David that evening in the particular way she had come to tell him things she considered important, which was directly and without preamble, sitting across the table from him with the lamps on and his full attention. He was very still for a moment, the way he was when something had genuinely moved him and he was managing it internally first, and then something broke across his face that she had not seen before, a kind of joy that was almost surprised at itself. And he came around the table to her and took her hands and held them and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am absolutely fine," she said. "I've been tired, which is why I suspected, but I feel very well." "Good," he said. "Good." He was still holding her hands. He looked down at them for a moment and then up at her. "Rosa." "I know," she said, because she did. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was different from the previous winter, though in the best of ways. Rosa was visibly pregnant by December, and had opinions about this that she shared freely. Mostly the opinion that growing a person was significantly more work than advertised, and that whoever had decided the first several months were supposed to be a secret had clearly never had to manage a ranch's accounts while feeling as though they'd consumed something that disagreed with them profoundly. David was attentive in the way that she had expected he would be, practically, making sure she had what she needed and checking on her frequently without hovering, because he had learned in the year they had been together that hovering was not something she tolerated. He also, in a gesture she found entirely characteristic of him, went to Uvalde and had a long conversation with Dr. Sutton about what she should know and what he should watch for, and came back with a small book on the subject that he had apparently bought at the general store and read on the way home. She found the book on the kitchen table when she came in from the garden. She picked it up, looked at the cover, looked at him. "I like to be informed," he said, with a dignity that nearly made her laugh. The baby came in April of 1875 in the bedroom of the Crawford Ranch house, with Dr. Sutton present and Elena Medina present and David present because Rosa had asked him to stay, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who would have walked through fire if she asked and said, of course, without hesitation. It was a boy. A vigorous, loud, black-haired boy who arrived at 3 in the morning, and immediately made his opinions about the world known in the clearest possible terms. They named him Samuel Hadley Crawford, taking her family name for his middle name, because it was important to her that something of her father's line continued. And David had said, of course. Again, with that immediate lack of hesitation that she found, she was never going to stop being grateful for. Samuel was an excellent baby in the sense that he was healthy and strong, and clearly intended to interact with the world at full volume from the very beginning. He was a challenging baby in the sense that he was healthy and strong, and clearly intended to interact with the world at full volume from the very beginning. The distinction was not always easy to maintain at 2 in the morning. But there were nights she sat up with Samuel in the rocking chair that David had moved to the bedroom and looked at her son in the lamplight and felt something so large she did not have a word for it. A love that was structural, the way the foundation of a building is structural, everything resting on it. David was good with Samuel in the way she had known he would be. He was easy and certain with him, the way a man is with a baby when he is not performing confidence but actually has it, some innate patience that expressed itself in the way he held the child, and in the fact that he got up as often as she did in the night without being asked. Joe and Alina's children adored Samuel, which helped, because it meant that when the ranch work was pressing, Rosa could often leave the baby in the capable hands of the Medina household, and know he was entirely safe and entirely loved. In the summer of 1875, James Crawford came to visit from St. Louis. He was the first family either of them had seen since the wedding, and his arrival was an event. He was like David in the way that siblings are often like each other in structure but different in execution. The same dark eyes and the same jaw, but dressed in a city lawyer's suit, and possessed of a gregariousness that his brother entirely lacked. James Crawford spent 10 days on the ranch, and by the end of it had developed a profound respect for what David and Rosa had built, a respect he expressed in the specific way lawyers express things, by finding 4 small issues with their paperwork that he fixed free of charge before he left. "I like her," James told David, within clear earshot of Rosa on his last evening. "I didn't think anyone would be good enough for you because you're unbearably particular, and you needed someone who would not be intimidated by that. I was wrong about the available candidates." "Thank you," Rosa said from across the room, before David could answer. James laughed and raised his glass of water because they did not have whiskey in the house as it happened, and said, "I'll be back in the spring." He was. He came back in the spring of 1876, and in the spring of 1877, and eventually, in 1878, he brought a woman named Margaret with him whom he introduced as his intended, a schoolteacher from St. Louis with red hair and the demeanor of someone who had dealt with a great many students and would not be fazed by anything the West Texas landscape threw at her. Rosa liked her immediately. "Your brother," Margaret said to Rosa on their second day, while the men were out checking the North Range, "has been telling James about this place since I've known him, which is to say for 2 years. He makes it sound like something out of a book." "What kind of book?" Rosa said. "A good one," Margaret said, and looked out the kitchen window at the range with the expression of someone who was recalibrating her understanding of something important. James and Margaret married in St. Louis that fall and came back to West Texas for their honeymoon, which was perhaps not what anyone would have predicted for a St. Louis lawyer, but made a certain kind of sense if you knew James Crawford at all. By 1878, the Crawford Ranch had grown. David and Joe had added 150 head of cattle over 4 years. The South Range was fully productive, and a new barn had gone up in the spring with the help of a working bee that included half the neighboring ranchers and their families, because that was how things got built in West Texas when you needed a barn. Rosa had expanded the kitchen garden into a serious food-producing enterprise that fed not just the family but contributed to what they traded in Uvalde, and she had begun keeping a second set of books that tracked the garden separately and showed it turning a modest but real profit. She was also teaching Clara Pryor, Helen's granddaughter, who had grown into a serious and determined young woman of 17 by then. Clara rode out to the ranch twice a week for lessons in mathematics and in writing, because Helen had written to Rosa the previous year saying that Clara's learning had outpaced what the Uvalde school could offer and would Rosa be willing, and Rosa had said yes immediately. "You're a good teacher," Clara told her one afternoon, after they had spent an hour on fractions and another on essay writing, which Clara had approached with the same intensity she applied to everything. "You're a good student," Rosa said. "Which is most of it?" "My grandmother says you were a mail-order bride," Clara said, with the directness of someone who is still learning which direct observations are appropriate and which are merely true. "Only to the wrong man. Is that right?" Rosa looked at her. "I answered a matrimonial advertisement," she said carefully, "and I made a wrong turn on the way there, and I ended up somewhere better." Clara thought about this. "That seems like it could have gone very badly," she said. "It could have," Rosa agreed. "I was very lucky." She paused, "and Mr. Crawford was kind." Clara looked around the ranch house with her serious eyes. "He seems like a good man," she said, with the judicial quality of someone issuing a verdict after careful deliberation. "He is," Rosa said, and meant it with everything she had. Samuel was 4 years old in the spring of 1879, a small person of considerable determination and enthusiasm, who followed David and Joe around the ranch with the purposeful energy of a very young cattle hand, and who had his mother's hazel eyes and his father's dark hair, and both of their stubborn when it mattered quality, which was going to be excellent for him as an adult, and was currently the main challenge of his life as a 4-year-old. Rosa was also, by that spring, aware that there was going to be another baby in the fall, a fact she had confirmed with Dr. Sutton on a March trip to Uvalde, and had told David in the manner she always told him important things, directly and across the kitchen table with the lamps on. He had the same expression he'd had when she told him about Samuel, the stillness and then the surprised joy, and then he had reached across the table and taken her hand and held it, and she had thought about the fact that this was exactly the same gesture he had made when she told him about Samuel, and she loved him for the consistency of it. "Are you feeling all right?" he said. "Exactly as before." "I am absolutely fine," she said. "Exactly as before." He smiled, which was not exactly as before, because this smile was larger and easier, the smile of a man who was not just happy but settled in his happiness, a man who had come to understand that good things could be lasting. Elena Medina was expecting too, as it happened, and they confirmed this fact about each other with the particular pleasure of women who have been through something together and are glad of the company. Their due dates were within 2 weeks of each other, which Elena said was obviously not a coincidence since the entire Crawford Ranch operation ran on a schedule. The second baby came in November of 1879, on a day that was not quite cold enough to be winter, and not quite warm enough to be autumn, an in-between West Texas day of low clouds and dry air. It was a girl this time, born with the same dark hair as Samuel, but with none of his volume, arriving quietly and then opening her eyes and looking around at everything with an expression of focused assessment that Rosa recognized immediately as her own expression when she had walked into a room that needed evaluating. They named her Catherine Eliza Crawford, Catherine for no family reason but simply because it was the name that suited her, and Eliza for Rosa's mother, who had laughed at her own jokes and deserved to be remembered. Elena Medina had a girl 2 weeks later, and the two babies grew up side by side the way ranch children did, the property lines between families meaning very little when everyone was part of the same daily life of the land. Samuel was a natural older brother in the sense that he immediately felt responsible for Catherine, and this expressed itself in the way older sibling responsibility often does, with a mixture of genuine protectiveness and periodic tyranny, both of which Rosa and David managed with the fairness they tried to apply to everything. David and Joe broke the North Range that year and put in winter wheat, an experiment that Joe had wanted to try for 2 years, having seen it done on a cousin spread further north, and which Rosa had looked at the numbers for and pronounced likely to pay. It paid. By 1880, the Crawford Ranch was producing both cattle and grain, and the stability of that combination meant a kind of financial security that neither of them had quite had before. Rosa continued the books, continued the garden, continued the lessons with Clara and with two other children from neighboring families who had started coming to the ranch for instruction. She had not intended to be a teacher. But there was a clear need, and she had the knowledge, and it turned out that she was good at it in the same way she was good at other things that required you to understand how people thought and to meet them where they were. In the spring of 1881, Clara Pryor passed her examinations and went to normal school in San Antonio to train as a schoolteacher, which she had said since she was 12 she would do, and which she did with the implacable follow-through of someone who has never doubted her own direction. She came back to Uvalde 2 years later and opened the school, and she sent Rosa a letter the day the school opened that said, among other things, that Rosa had been the reason she had been ready. Rosa kept the letter in the kitchen, tucked into the frame of the window above the sink where she could see it. The years had a rhythm. David rode out before dawn and came back at dusk, and in the evenings he read or he sat with her on the porch, or they talked through the business of the ranch and the family and the wider world, the news that came in the papers that were a week old by the time they reached West Texas, but news nonetheless. Rosa read too, always had, and they shared books back and forth across the years in the way people do when they have common ground in their minds, sometimes arguing about what they'd read with the productive intensity of two people who took ideas seriously. She loved him. She had known it on a porch in December of 1873 watching stars appear over West Texas hills. She knew it differently now, with 8 years of a life behind it, the specific love that comes from knowing someone across all the weathers of things, the ordinary days and the hard ones and the days that were extraordinary in quiet ways. She loved the man who got up in the night with the babies. She loved the man who talked to Joe Medina with respect and had put that respect into legal paper. She loved the man who read at his table by candlelight and who had ridden 14 miles for tea and who shook her hand like she was a person worth taking seriously. She told him this sometimes, not on occasions but just on ordinary evenings, because she believed in saying things plainly. He told her too. He was not a man of many elaborate words, and she did not need elaborate words. He said it simply and he meant it with everything, and she could tell the difference between someone who meant something simply and someone who said something simply because it was all they had. One evening in the autumn of 1881, David sat down beside her on the porch, which was their habit in the good weather, and was quiet for a while, which was also their habit, and then he said, "Do you ever think about how it started, the wrong turn?" "Sometimes," she said. She looked out at the ranch, the last of the evening light on the hills to the west, the chimney of the Medina house visible a mile east. "Do you?" "I think about it as the best possible wrong turn," he said, "though I'm aware that's not very useful as navigation advice." "No," she said and smiled. "It really isn't." He took her hand in the particular way he had, not reaching for it so much as just finding it, the way you find something you know is there. The sky over the West Texas hills was going through its usual performance of color, the oranges and the pinks that she had come to think of as specific to this place, that she would not have seen from a boarding house in San Antonio or from a ranch 15 miles south that she had been headed to. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm glad you said stay anyway," she said. The air smelled of the kitchen garden and of the horses in the barn, and of the particular dry sweetness of West Texas in the fall, and the stars were about to appear over the east hills, as they always did, all at once, and Catherine was asleep inside, and Samuel was doing something that involved a stick and a great deal of earnest concentration in the yard, and Joe and Alina's children's voices were audible in the distance, and the clock on the mantelpiece inside was ticking with its steady, cheerful persistence. It was all exactly right. It had been, from the moment the wagon wheel broke and she walked in the wrong direction and knocked on the wrong door, the most right thing that had ever happened to her. In the spring of 1882, Rosa turned 33 years old, and David brought her something wrapped in brown paper that turned out to be a new copy of Emma by Jane Austen, a good clean edition from the bookseller in San Antonio that James had sent out with a note that said he had happened to notice the old copy on the shelf was getting fragile. She held the book and looked at it and then looked at David. "I remember you holding my mother's copy," he said. "The first night." "I remember," she said. "I thought you should have your own," he said. She put the book on the shelf, her own shelf now, their shelf, beside the Roman history and the cattle husbandry and the almanacs and the Bible. And she thought about a woman who had knocked on the wrong door in 1873 and had been offered water and a room and a meal. And then something larger, the kind of thing you did not find in a matrimonial advertisement, the kind of thing that did not come from walking in the right direction. It came from someone opening a door and saying stay anyway, and she had stayed. Clara Pryor's school in Uvalde was full by its second year, and Rosa helped her with supplies and with books when she could, and eventually the school board, which had initially been skeptical of a young woman running the enterprise, was forced to acknowledge that the Uvalde school was producing some of the best educated children in the county. Clara wrote to Rosa every month, long letters full of the details of her students and her life, and Rosa wrote back, and the correspondence went on for years and was one of the things Rosa valued most in her world. Helen Pryor was still running the general store at 70, with the same broad shoulders and the same freely shared opinions, and Rosa made a point of stopping in every time she was in Uvalde and spending at least an hour in her company. Helen had opinions about everything from cattle prices to politics to the novels that came through on the freight wagons, and agreeing with her was not always possible, but listening to her was always worthwhile. Joe Medina's family grew. They had 5 children by 1882, and Joe and Alina had built onto their house twice, and the southern range was entirely Joe's domain now, his stewardship of it visible in the quality of the cattle, and the condition of the fences, and the careful management of the water sources that his family had known for generations. There was a difficult autumn in 1882 when a late drought hit the county hard, and more than one neighbor lost animals, and David and Joe between them made some hard decisions about culling the herd early that cost them money in the short term but saved the breeding stock, and Rosa went over the books with the kind of intensive attention she brought to crises and found enough room in the margins to see them through. It was not easy, but they had built the kind of operation that could handle a bad year, and they came out the other side of it intact, which was not true for everyone in the county, and Rosa was acutely aware of how much of that was the groundwork laid over years rather than luck. A new railroad spur came within 30 miles of Uvalde in 1883, which changed the cattle business significantly, opening markets further east and making the twice-annual trip to Uvalde market less critical as a selling point. David and Joe spent a winter thinking through how to reorient the operation, and came to conclusions that Rosa then ran through the accounts and found sound. And by 1884, they were selling cattle east to San Antonio at prices that would have seemed impossible 10 years earlier. Samuel was 9 years old in 1884, and he had decided with the absolute conviction of 9-year-olds that he was going to be a cattleman, which David received with the equanimity of a father who had suspected this was coming, but was not going to make any decisions about it for several more years. Catherine was 5, and she had decided with equal conviction that she was going to be a doctor like Dr. Sutton, which Rosa received with the equanimity of a mother who had raised a daughter to believe this was a reasonable aspiration, because it was. Rosa told David about Catherine's declared intention on one of their porch evenings, and he was quiet with the thinking quiet, and then he said, "Good, she should do what she's suited to." "It'll require schooling," Rosa said, Serious schooling, more than Clara's school can offer eventually. We'll figure that out when we get there, he said. We've figured out harder things. She put her head on his shoulder because it was there and she wanted to, which was still, after 11 years, one of the more straightforward pleasures of her life. They had a good life. They had built it from a wrong turn and a wagon wheel and a man who opened a door and said stay anyway. And it was not the life she had been headed toward, not the life she had planned in the pages of the matrimonial news, but it was a life so thoroughly hers, so completely grown from who she actually was, that she could not imagine a planned life fitting as well. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on. The kitchen garden produced. The cattle grazed the range that stretched west to the hills. The books on the shelf multiplied, hers alongside his alongside theirs. The children grew, and the nights were sometimes long and sometimes short and sometimes full of stars and sometimes full of clouds. And through all of it, there was the man who had found her hand on a porch in December as if it were something he had always known was there. She had shown up at the wrong ranch. He had said stay anyway. And the years that followed had been, in every way that mattered, exactly right. On the last evening of the last day of 1884, Rosa stood on the Crawford Ranch porch in the cold West Texas night with her husband beside her and her children asleep inside, and the stars out over the hills in their usual extravagance. And she thought about all of it, the cracked wagon wheel and the wrong map, and the knock on an unknown door, and the man who had opened it. And she thought that wrong was perhaps not the right word for any of it. Perhaps there was no wrong turn when the turn took you somewhere true. Perhaps the life you were supposed to have was not the one you had planned, but the one you were brave enough to stay in when it offered itself. She leaned against David in the cold and felt his arm come around her, and felt the warmth of him, and the solidity of him, and the particular peace of being known by someone, fully known, and found to be not just enough but exactly right. "Happy New Year," she said, when the moment of midnight arrived in whatever way midnights arrive in places where there are no bells and no crowds, just the sense of something turning over into something new. "Happy New Year, Rosa," he said, and pressed a kiss to her temple and pulled her closer against the cold, and they stood together in the enormous West Texas night and watched the year end and another one begin, and it was good, and it was theirs, and it was everything.